larger communities. Sometimes it's just a matter of having the ability to keep up with the red tape. The bill before us reauthorizes the EPA's program providing technical assistance to small public water systems. S611 maintains the existing statutory authorization of $15 million annually, including 3% for technical assistance to public water systems owned or operated by Indian tribes, but extends authorizations through fiscal year 2020. S611 also authorized EPA to provide technical assistance programs to small public water systems through grants or cooperative agreements made to nonprofit organizations. The bill requires preference in awarding grants to nonprofits that are most qualified and experienced and that small water systems find most beneficial and effective, a feature we heard about during our February hearing and again last week. Moving this bill without amendment is important. While the House Appropriation Committee has not provided small water system technical assistance funding for fiscal year 2016, that committee has left open the option that it would reevaluate funding for this matter as part of a later annual budget bill if Congress enacts a fresh authorization. People who live in rural communities deserve every bit of water quality and technical resources that folks who live in the densely populated urban centers do. I urge support for Senate 611 and now recognize my friend Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for convening a subcommittee markup of S611, the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Act. This legislation is a step forward on drinking water. I also want to thank our colleague, Representative Harper, for introducing H.R. 2853, the House companion bill to Senator Wicker's bill. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of that legislation. It is a good bill, and I support it. We began the the technical assistance offered by organizations such as the Rural Community Assistance Partnership and the National Rural Water Association is vital to small and rural water systems across our country. I realize you hope to have this markup move quickly. We hope not to have the two hearings on e-manifest and low-level nuclear waste immediately preceding this markup. So much for our hopes. However, we do have some amendments to offer. We began the 114th with some important successes. We marked up Representative Lott's bill to authorize a strategic plan for dealing with algal blooms in source waters for drinking water systems. There was bipartisan cooperation on that bill, and it received a strong bipartisan endorsement by the House. Working together, we produced a good TSCA reform bill, another bill that received strong bipartisan support when it passed our House. Ultimately, I expect this bill to receive the same strong support. However, as I indicated earlier this week, I and other members of our subcommittee are anxious to tackle other important issues that the subcommittee has not yet addressed. It has been 12 years since we last authorized the drinking water programs in our jurisdiction. With S611, we are reauthorizing a small but very important program in this area, although I believe the program should be reauthorized at a higher level. We should at least be accounting for 12 years of inflation, so the program can deliver the same level of service reliably. And with a growing backlog of water infrastructure needs, we should be doing much more to assist states and their water utilities to reduce that backlog. The Drinking Water SRF was authorized at $1 billion back in 2003. It is the main source of federal assistance for water utilities. It needs to be reauthorized also and at a higher level than was provided in 2003. Our inaction is also adding to the expenses of state and local governments and forcing increases in water utility rates for our consumers. Across the country, we experience over 700 water main breaks per day, breaks that result in losses of treated water from water systems. That represents a loss of not only revenue to the water utility, but a loss of water to businesses and households. Infrastructure does not repair itself. It does not improve with age. Funding planned strategic programs of infrastructure repair and replacement costs far less than doing emergency repairs. Yesterday, Mr. Chair, you expressed concern that the authorization for e-manifest expires at the end of 2015 and that the Appropriations Committee may decide not to fund programs that do not have a current authorization. Well, if that is the case, we have a number of very vulnerable programs. The issues within this subcommittee's jurisdiction are serious, and they have significant impacts on communities in every member's district. I know there are budget concerns, but we simply cannot cut our way to prosperity. We need to make strategic investments to provide the infrastructure needed to support economic opportunity. and we can afford to clean up contaminated properties and return them to productive use. We can afford to repair and upgrade our water infrastructure, and we can afford to manage waste responsibly. In fact, we cannot afford to ignore these needs. You've proven you are willing to work on tough issues through your efforts on issues like nuclear waste disposal and TSCA reform. By comparison, issues like drinking water and brownfields are easy. So S611 is a small but very good step forward. I urge my colleagues to support the measure and also state that we should now move on to address the bigger problems. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the co-author of the legislation, at least the House version, Mr. Harper from Mississippi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member, Mr. Taco, for his support and cooperation in bringing this matter forward. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup of S611, the Grassroots Rural and Small Community Water Systems Assistance Act. I appreciate the committee's commitment to this issue as we work to reauthorize this important technical assistance language. In a legislative hearing just last week, we heard from rural water professionals about the importance and timeliness of passing S611. Rural water experts from the Mississippi Rural Water Association and the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, Inc., testified to the benefits of S611 and, of course, our companion bill, and helped provide insight into the needs of our rural water constituents. This insight will be beneficial as we continue to move forward and discuss this issue. I believe this gives predictability that's needed, and as we know, and as is stated in S611, 90%, more than 90% of the community water systems in this country serve a population of less than 10,000 individuals. So this is something that we do need to move forward. I know that it was mentioned, maybe some concerns about having other hearings, but those such as E-Manifest and the one that just preceded on low-level radioactive waste, while maybe not the most glamorous topics that we're going to hear this year, are nevertheless necessary. And I'm certainly willing to work with the ranking member to identify programs that perhaps that can be cut or reduced that he thinks are not necessary, and try to transfer some of that money to more pressing areas such as this. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, the chairman noted that the bill passed the Senate by unanimous consent and suggested there are no substantive concerns with the legislation. However, I think several serious substantive concerns were raised by Democratic members of the subcommittee at last week's hearing, and I hope that we can address those concerns today, or at least reach a bipartisan consensus about the potentially ambiguous terminology used in the bill. Such a consensus would address many of the substantive concerns on this side of the aisle and smooth this bill's path into law. I've heard from the majority that the need for this bill is pressing because of the appropriations process, but Democrats have repeatedly offered to work on this legislation for at least 8 months, and we should not give up on good policy simply because the majority delayed consideration. I'd like to mention some of the specific concerns which I raised last week and which could be addressed today. First, the legislation creates a preference for nonprofits that are most qualified and the most experienced. Similar language in past Democratic proposals would have given priority to the most effective organizations. I think these terms are intended to be synonymous, and we all agree that the money should go to the most effective organizations. Witnesses at last week's hearing certainly shared that view, but the language could be more clear, Mr. Chairman. Second, the bill requires EPA to determine which nonprofits, small systems in each state find the most beneficial. And this could be interpreted as requiring surveys in each state, an exercise that witnesses at last week's hearing opposed. And third, the bill does not set out specific areas of technical assistance that are eligible for funding, leaving open the possibility that important work will go unfunded. Past Democratic proposals have delineated several important areas of technical assistance, including source water protection and identifying options for water and energy efficiency. And lastly, and very importantly, the bill leaves unaddressed the major challenges facing water systems today. Water systems are facing serious threats from outdated infrastructure, lack of funding, emerging contaminants, and extreme weather. We in Congress have continued to underfund infrastructure improvements and have continued to undermine efforts to address climate change, so we should expect these problems to get worse before they get better. Resources are central to any conversation about safe drinking water. Much of our nation's drinking water infrastructure is well beyond its useful life and in desperate need of replacement. But this bill would reauthorize only the small pot of money for technical assistance, not the large pot of money for infrastructure repairs. It is imperative that this subcommittee take on the important task of reauthorizing the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, ensuring that fracking is done safely, ensuring source water protection, addressing drought, and planning for climate change. The majority has so far been unwilling to take up these issues, but I don't think they can wait. So I hope that we can have a fruitful discussion of these issues today and in the coming months, and I thank the chairman for calling this markup and yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair reminds members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there further opening statements? Seeing none, the chair now calls up Senate 611 and asks the clerk to report.
S611, an act to amend the Safe Drinking Water Act to reauthorize technical assistance to small public water systems and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any amendments? Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Sir, which number?
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to have the amendments numbered 1 through 6 considered en bloc.
Without objection, so ordered. So that would be all the amendments there together.
Okay. Amendment to S611 offered by Mr. Tonko. Amendments
1 through 6.
1 through 6.
No.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These are very simple amendments to clarify several important aspects of the technical assistance programs for small and rural water systems. Small and rural systems have their size and lack of resources in common. However, the witnesses at our hearing talked about the wide range of problems they encounter in their work with different systems. I want to ensure the program provides sufficient flexibility to the assistance providers so they can address the greatest needs of the small systems they serve. I included many of these things in the technical assistance provisions of the bill I introduced at the end of the last Congress. Amendment number 1 makes a one-word change. It substitutes effective for experienced. You can be experienced and still not be effective. We are not providing more money for this program, so I want to ensure that every dollar spent delivers the best possible service. Amendments 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 add several items to the list of activities that can be performed with funding under this program, including assistance in identifying threats to source waters, assistance with increasing water or energy efficiency, assistance with planning and adaptation for climate change, assistance with planning and adaptation for drought, and assistance with identifying alternative source waters in the event of contamination. Small and rural systems are a feature of every state. The issue of source water protection, protection of both quality and quantity, is vitally important to every water utility. It is especially important for small and rural systems. The higher the source water quality, the lower the treatment costs. And for small systems, keeping treatment costs low helps them to keep rates low for their customers. It helps them to avoid purchasing and operating complex, expensive treatment technologies. One of the largest expenses for water utilities is energy. It takes considerable energy to move and to treat water. There are opportunities for reducing energy usage in a water treatment system. Technical assistance should include advice on how to conserve energy. Finally, drought and climate change. There are many small systems located in areas subject to severe storms, flooding, sea level rise, and other extreme events that are becoming more frequent and severe due to changes in climate. Rather than waiting until an emergency arises, small system operators should be able to get advice on cost-effective ways to make their systems more resilient and less vulnerable to service disruptions due to changes in weather and climate conditions. There are already many areas in the West and Southwest that are experiencing record drought. These conditions impact both the quantity and the quality of source water available to small and rural systems. People living in rural areas need safe drinking water. The technical assistance programs certainly ensure they receive it. Mr. Chair, I would have preferred to make some of these changes in a manager's amendment to the bill. However, I would consider withdrawing my en bloc amendments in exchange for your commitment that our staffs work together on the bill's report to clarify that these topic areas can be addressed through this program. These are not mandates, they are options that can be exercised if a small system operator needs to address these issues. So, Mr. Chair, I ask that we get a commitment so that I can withdraw the en bloc amendments.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
The our concern with the amendment is that because there's two issues. One, any change to the to the bill itself will then throw it back to the Senate, which we're not sure will pass it and move it to the President's desk rapidly. The second concern is that the amendment and the line item of issues diverts already limited scarce money to other programs that, in my discussions with the rural water folks, is not their most pending need, and so it's limiting the pot of money. We will consider, we will engage in conversations. I don't want to make a promise that I can't keep, but we're open to have discussions on how we can discuss this.
I'd like to say something in support of Mr. Tonko's amendment. But if you want, I'll yield to Mr. Tonko. If you
go
want. Okay. Let me explain why. I'm not sure that I'm next, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Ms. Tonko has 20 seconds left. If you just want to strike the last word on his time, then you have.
No, it's all right. I'd rather have my own time.
Right. Ms. Tonko, you want to yield back?
I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks time? Chair recognizes the ranking member of full committee, Mr. Pullman, for 5 minutes.
I just want to strike the last word in support of this amendment. I thank the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tonko, for his thoughtful amendment, which would address the substantive concerns that Democratic members have raised. As I said in my opening statement, my Democratic colleagues and I have substantive concerns with ambiguous language in the bill, and this amendment would address those ambiguities. He obviously replaces the word experience with the much clearer word effective. We heard at last week's hearing that the intent of the provision is to prioritize effective organizations, so I think this change would make the language more clear without changing the intent. The amendment would also explicitly list important areas of technical assistance to make clear that Congress intends for this money to cover the range of needs of small water systems. Specific areas called out in this amendment include protecting source water, increasing water and energy efficiency, adapting for climate change, and more. Water systems across this country are in dire straits, and climate change will present them with greater and greater challenges. As we reauthorize this funding, we should ensure that it will continue to be useful to water systems in the future as they face these challenges. Now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle might think this amendment is not necessary, and I guess we were hoping we could reach agreement here today, and in report language that we share the same intent, but I'm not getting the impression that that's the case. So let me just say that these are important clarifications for the bill, and again, I thank Mr. Tonko for raising these points and urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time.
Yes.
Anyone else seek time? I'd like to strike the last word. Then I'll yield some time.
Okay.
So I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to talk, first of all, to the ranking member full committee. I don't want to be vague. We'll try to work on some of the language, but I don't want to make a promise that I just can't keep based upon some of the provisions. So let's give us a try.
Well, will the gentleman yield?
I would.
My understanding is Mr. Tonko is simply asking for report language. He's not asking that you adopt the amendment. But my problem, Mr. Chairman, is that you don't seem to be agreeable to to report language that would accomplish these goals? You're saying you might be, but you're not. Why is there a problem, since we're all sharing the same goal here, why is there a problem with the report language that would achieve the goals of what Mr. Tonko is suggesting?
And reclaiming my time, we're happy to look at trying to address report language. We want to be careful that we don't jeopardize the passage of this bill and challenges and frustration with the Senate based upon what we may or may not have said. So,
But if you could yield to me, I mean, that's why we're suggesting the report language, because we don't want to have to send it back to the Senate. But having been here so many years, I won't say how many, I've never had a situation where, because of report language, that the bill has to go back to the Senate. That's just expressing the intent of the subcommittee or of the committee.
we'll do everything we can to try to address some of these issues in the report language.
Mr. Chair, will you yield?
I would yield.
Just to the concern about, you know, the options here that we're asking for, not mandates. But if a small rural system has a concern that can enable them to be a stronger outcome for the consumers they serve, with technical assistance, perhaps with source water, all we're asking is that we not limit options here. It's not a mandate, and it's not impacting the money. We're asking that options not be limited. And again, we're asking that consideration be made to include this in the bill's report.
Right, and reclaiming my time, I think the only concern is, and you've rightly raised, that it's a limited pot of money. Everybody would like to do more. This is not the venue to do more because of the Senate language. And we've broadened the scope so that the real safe drinking water aspects of this can be protected by this advice and counsel. And as we expand the opportunity, we may lessen the ability for the expertise to go to those needed systems that are really trying to make sure they have safe water to their constituents. We're just trying not to dilute the pot right now. That's kind of the basic.
But I think we can, you know, what we've heard in, if the gentleman would yield again.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Mr. Chair, if you would yield again.
I would yield.
What we heard in testimony was that these are ways to save money, to be more efficient, more effective. And by limiting options, I think that we could cause consequences that are unnecessary. So again, if we could just include language in a report, if you can offer the commitment to our side to work on developing that report language, I'm willing to withdraw my en bloc amendments.
And reclaiming my time, we are open to considering what language we can include. We want to be very careful that we can't, report language can't amend a bill. I mean, it just gives instructions. So if the report language is opposite or makes, in essence, an assumed change to a bill, that's not the intent of report language.
Well, if the bill passes in the House, it then, if you'll yield again.
I will yield.
If the bill passes the House, then it goes to the President's desk.
That's correct.
So I believe that, you know, we can work amongst the two sides here, between the two sides, and amongst all of us, Senate and here, to address that report language. I just don't see why we would limit these options.
I would only restate in my 13 seconds remaining that we don't want to dilute the pot. There's limited money. It goes for safe drinking water to poor systems that don't have the technical expertise on their own. And by expanding it, in the case of some of the listed items, is problematic for this bill and not a larger bill. And with that, my time's expired. Anyone else seeking time to speak on the amendment? No, I will just wait.
We can call for a vote, or we can say we'll work with you between now and full committee.
Mr. Chair,
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
why don't we take your offer to work with us between now and report to the full committee? And if we believe there's progress made, that hopefully will satisfy us.
I'm
And
happy.
with, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
I'd be happy to make that effort to see what we can do between the two committees. And with that, we'll see where we go from there.
Okay. Then I will withdraw my en bloc amendments in the hope that we can address not limiting options.
Gentleman withdraws his amendment. The question now, are there any other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question. Oh, there is.
Chairman, let me just point out there were several amendments, just so you know.
Oh, I thought there was 6 in block.
No, those, there are other amendments.
Oh, I was only told there were 7 total.
All right, I don't know what they told you, but I just want you to know there's a few.
There's one more.
You can do yours next.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sir, we have 7 amendments at the desk, the 6 that were considered en bloc and 1 that we
One
just
more.
received.
Where are the others?
Is that your understanding? Okay. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas to offer his amendment.
That is Green 44. No?
Sir, we don't have that amendment.
All right, let's just take a minute to see. I know there are 3 or 4 amendments. I don't know what happened here, if you bear with us, Mr. Chairman. I don't know why you were under the impression that they were all going to be on block, but whatever. Let's take a minute.
Yeah, he's ready, I think. Will the clerk report?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
A point of order is reserved. A lot of excitement for this committee.
Amendment to S611, offered by Mr. Gene Green of Texas.
The point of order is reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I'm offering today is a common sense proposal to help deal with one of the newest and fastest growing waste streams in our country, electronic waste. Create tens of thousands of middle-class jobs here in the United States by requiring that American-produced e-waste be recycled and disposed in our country. And my amendment is based on legislation I've introduced for the last 3 Congresses, the Responsible Electronics Recycling Act. E-waste is a product of the millions of discarded computers, TVs, cell phones, and other consumer electronics Americans throw away or recycle annually. In 2011, EPA estimated that 3.4 million tons of e-waste is generated in our country each year. The management of used electronics presents a number of significant environmental, health, and national security concerns. Much of the e-waste being collected in the United States is being exported to China, India, or West Africa, where the GAO has determined that most of these receiving companies lack the capacity to safely recycle and dispose of these discarded and used electronics. Also of great concern is the growing recognition of the Department of Defense and our national security agencies on the appearance of defective electronic equipment in our nation's weapon systems. Much of this defective electronic equipment originated as our own e-waste that was exported to countries like China, falsely relabeled and resold to us as newly fully functioning equipment. These problems are occurring because, unlike our European and Japanese friends, the United States does not have a comprehensive national approach for the export of used electronics. My amendment would provide such a comprehensive approach by creating a new section under the Resource Recovery, Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, to prohibit the export of restricted electronic waste to countries outside the OECD or the European Union. While tested and working equipment can still be exported to promote reuse, other consumer electronic equipment, parts, and material derived from them that contain toxic chemicals could not be exported to developing nations. The legislation is supported by industry stakeholders, retailers, and the environmental community. Again, it's common sense and would be much to help our economy and the environment. Mr. Chairman, I've asked many times for a hearing on this issue, and I would hope that you would consider it's an important issue, and I hope the subcommittee will examine this issue in the near future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw my amendment, but I'm sure like at least a commitment that we'll look at this legislation and see if we can have a hearing on it.
Let's talk, Mr. Green.
You and I talk a lot. I understand it. I still withdraw the amendment, but I think it's something that this Congress, we could at least have a hearing on it to address something, talk about the issue.
I understand your concern. Appreciate you offering and withdrawing the amendment. Anyone else have an amendment? The gentleman from California is recognized. Do you have an amendment at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk report the amendment?
Amendment to S611, offered by Mr. McNerney of California.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here we are again working on a bipartisan bill that most of us agree is needed, but doesn't address the bigger picture facing our nation on water shortages and water infrastructure needs. The Safe Drinking Water Act's mission to protect public health by regulating the nation's public drinking water supply hasn't changed, but the new elements have emerged, such as climate change and drought, that threaten our water supplies. More and more states, including my state of California, have been stricken by drought conditions. The result is that water and energy prices increase, agricultural production suffers, and access to critical resources becomes more challenging. Even in normal years, some areas of California find it difficult to meet demands for water. The state population continues to grow, meaning more families, farms, and businesses will rely on regional water supplies for their daily needs. You all have heard of the California water wars, I assume. We must consider all options, including technical assistance, strategic planning and managing for drought conditions, investments, and new technologies that can better tackle the need to do more with less. My amendment directs the EPA to develop a strategic plan for assessing and managing the risks of drought to drinking water that is provided by public water systems. It also establishes guidance around analytical methods and ways in which to protect drinking water as supplies become limited due to drought conditions. There are currently more than 160,000 public water systems providing water to most all of Americans at some time of their lives. Ensuring the best available science and best practices are used when dealing with a drought is common sense and will allow us to better protect our towns when we are forced to manage scarce water resources while protecting public health. The need to continue working on this, but at this point, for technical reasons, I will withdraw the
Mr. McNerney, could I ask you not withdraw it because I wanted to make a statement.
Yes. Okay. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, full committee, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that this amendment will be withdrawn, but I did want to stress the importance of it because I think that the problem with S611 is, again, it addresses only one small part of the challenges facing water systems across the country, and systems of all sizes need more assistance than this bill would provide. And I think it's imperative that we provide guidance to water systems to address climate-related issues and adapt to the challenges presented by drought. Now, Mr. McNerney's amendment would help to address these issues by requiring EPA to plan for and manage the risks associated with drought. This plan would coordinate efforts and information to assist water systems. Right now, the western United States and the southwestern U.S. are coping with serious drought conditions. We all know that. and they'll increase in intensity and frequency in coming years as a result of climate change. And these extreme drought events pose an enormous risk to our drinking water supplies. Aquifer levels are dropping, wells are drying up, contaminant concentration in wells are increasing, meaning some of them are no longer suitable as drinking water sources. And water systems need consolidated data they can apply, information about the available feasible tools, and guidance on the best practices for taking defensive and offensive actions against drought. I don't think this subcommittee can continue to ignore major issues that matter to the American public, and we should pass this amendment to address the serious drinking water risks associated with drought. So if we can't adopt this amendment today, obviously it's going to be withdrawn. I do hope we can work together in the coming months to take on this challenge, because I think that providing safe and reliable drinking water is a basic function of government, and we have a responsibility to help water systems meet that obligation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is the amendment withdrawn?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw the amendment now.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 8.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to S 611, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The State Revolving Loan Fund that was established in the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments in 1996 is a major source of funding for drinking water infrastructure and compliance assistance for our water utilities. The SRF has not been reauthorized, and its authorization expired in 2003, some 12 years ago. If indeed the Appropriations Committee decides that programs without a current authorization should not receive funding, drinking water systems across the country will be in real trouble, and so will the millions of people that rely on them to deliver safe drinking water. We already have a tremendous backlog of infrastructure needs for these systems, and states and local governments cannot do this alone. So my amendment provides an extension of the current authorization for the drinking water SRF. At a minimum, we should be reauthorizing the SRF at a level that covers inflation over the past 12 years. That would set the authorizing the program at $1.52 billion, and that is what my amendment does. Safe drinking water programs are public health programs. Delivery of safe, clean water to homes and businesses is dependent upon infrastructure, the network of pipes and treatment facilities that carry water from the source to its final destination. One of the most cost-effective and important things we ever initiated in this country was the disinfection and treatment of drinking water. Jersey City was the first to do it in 1908. Other cities quickly followed. Why? Because water treatment dramatically improved public health by reducing the transmission of infectious diseases that were all too common at the time, including cholera and typhoid. In fact, nothing we've done since, including the development of penicillin, has done more to improve public health and reduce infectious disease than providing safe, clean drinking water. For the past 100 years, communities large and small across our country have been able to rely on the delivery of safe drinking water. That is a record we should be very proud of. It is a standard that we must maintain. As I have observed before, one of the most basic characteristics of a modern society is its ability to deliver clean water to every home, business, and public building in communities large and small, urban and rural. If we are to extend this excellent 100-year record, we need to address the backlog of infrastructure needs, workforce issues, and constraints in maintenance and operating budgets that plague water utilities across our country. Reauthorizing the SRF is the least we should do. The investments we've made in safe drinking water have paid tremendous dividends back to us over the years. But now these systems need attention. Our health and our well-being depend on access to safe drinking water. Our economy depends on access to safe drinking water. And the added bonus is that the funding to rebuild these systems would simply create jobs. I urge support for my amendment to ensure that we maintain basic support for this essential program by extending the authorization for the drinking water SRF. I will yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
Anyone else wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I appreciate my colleague from New York referencing the progressive nature of New Jersey City. That was pretty good.
We love our neighbors.
Okay. I just want to support this amendment. Our water infrastructure is in a dangerous state of disrepair. Most of it's been determined to be at or beyond the end of its useful life. Every time EPA has assessed our drinking water infrastructure need, the need has gone up significantly, and industry estimates are even higher. The American Water Works Association has estimated that it will take more than $1 trillion investment in water infrastructure over the next 25 years to sustain delivery of clean and safe water. And time and again, we've heard testimony that greater investment in drinking water infrastructure is desperately needed. Just last week at the Environment Subcommittee's hearing on this bill, we heard that any incremental increase in infrastructure funding would help water systems. And we've heard from the majority that programs with expired authorizations are in danger of going unfunded. We simply can't allow that to happen for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and we can't keep taking clean water for granted. So I just would say, Mr. Chairman, that providing the American people with safe drinking water is a fundamental duty of the government, and we can't do that without investing in our infrastructure. This amendment is an important step towards helping public water systems continue to deliver safe, affordable drinking water to the American people. I hope we can work together on this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield to the gentleman from New York. I know you probably want to.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Pallone. Mr. Chair, I will withdraw the amendment for purposes of technical concern and appreciate the support echoed by Representative Pallone.
The amendment was withdrawn, and I appreciate the member doing that for obviously the consistency of the bill that we're moving at this time. Is there any other amendments? The gentlelady from California, for what purpose do you rise?
I do have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Will the clerk report the amendment?
Amendment to S 611, offered by Mrs. Capps of California.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of our amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ensuring that everyone has access to secure, reliable water systems, of course, is paramount importance and should be a top priority in Congress, and that means we should consider water as it applies to all communities across this country. Furthermore, while we clearly must consider the provision of water, it is also important to support water-related services, including wastewater treatment, stormwater management plans, under both current and changing future conditions. Changing climatic and hydraulic conditions across the country are already impacting water and water services availability, and these changes are only predicted to intensify in the future. Climate change is a reality, and to ignore it is both unwise and irresponsible. We are experiencing changing conditions today. Reservoirs are drying up, and floods are overwhelming storm system. Coastal areas are being threatened by sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. Threats to safe drinking water are diverse and serious, and we have a responsibility to help communities mitigate them. We must be prepared. We can either choose to invest in our water infrastructure proactively, or we can spend very much more down the road when the repairs are more costly. And that's why I am offering this amendment, which is identical to my Water Infrastructure Resiliency and Sustainability Act. My amendment simply would help ensure our local drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater operators have the resources they need to plan and implement projects to adapt their infrastructure to changing hydrological conditions. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. These threats do not differentiate between rural communities and urban ones, or between Democratic and Republican districts. And that's why my amendment is supported by a very broad group of stakeholders, including the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, American Public Works Association, National Association of Water Companies, and the National Association of Clean Water Agencies. When it comes to basic needs, of course, water is at the top of the list. Access to clean and reliable water is not a luxury, it is a fundamental right. My amendment recognizes our responsibility as policymakers to help protect this right for all of our constituents. Ignoring the problem is not going to make it go away. Like it or not, we know that climate and hydrological conditions are changing. We owe it to our constituents to respect the science and do everything we can to make sure they have safe water to drink, adequate wastewater treatment, and appropriate stormwater management now and in the future. This amendment would strengthen the underlying bill by ensuring that we are not only considering the availability of water under current conditions, but that we are adequately prepared to respond to water availability changes now and in the future. This amendment provides a much-needed forward-looking approach to water infrastructure, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Could I ask you to yield me your time remaining?
I'd be happy to yield to my colleague.
Thank you. I just wanted to urge support for this amendment. Again, it addresses the climate change issue, which is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and water systems are on the front lines of the battle to mitigate its effects. And drought, extreme weather, storm surge, and higher temperatures all affect the ability of water systems to continue to deliver safe and reliable drinking water. Water systems may need to move intakes, change treatment techniques, develop procedures to address harmful algal blooms, and more. And we can't expect water systems to meet these challenges without guidance and assistance. Water systems already face $384 billion in infrastructure costs over the next 20 years, and the effects of climate change could dramatically increase those costs. The American people are relying on us to work on the most important and pervasive issues affecting their lives, and instead the majority wants to work on the smallest parts of a massive issue and call that success. And I don't think, Mr. Chairman, we can afford to react to these issues any longer. We need to be proactive in protecting our nation's water supply, and so I think this amendment is very important. I yield back to the gentlewoman.
Does the gentle lady yield back her time?
I yield back my time.
Is the gentle lady considering withdrawing the amendment?
I would consider withdrawing the amendment if there's reason to do so.
Is there any other debate in the amendment? I'll recommend myself for 5 minutes. Again, I appreciate the comments from my colleagues on these water issues. This is a Senate bill that, if altered, then pushes it back to the Senate for consideration and probably passage. There's a time frame here with the appropriation bill still being in flux that this technical assistance is really doable if we move the Senate bill unamended, and we think it'll get to the President's desk, and with the appropriation process being maybe coming to some type of conclusion, technical assistance should be able to hopefully flow to the, based upon the, and I will admit, small criteria of what we can do with the amending. So I would hope that the gentlelady would reconsider.
With this encouragement, I will withdraw, but I also want to underscore the fact that I believe many of us believe we need to look at water from a more holistic perspective. I do withdraw the amendment.
Your comments noted. Thank you very much. Is there any other amendment? Gentleman from New Jersey?
I have an amendment at the desk, and this would be our last amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The point of order is reserved by the gentleman from Indiana, and the clerk will report.
Amendment to S611, offered by Mr. Pallone of New Jersey.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer this amendment to reauthorize the Brownfields program at EPA. As we heard yesterday and today, this markup is needed because a program with an expired authorization may go unfunded. The authorization for the Brownfield program is also expired, and funding for the program was cut by House appropriators this year. In fiscal year 2015, EPA received $80 million for the Brownfields program, $5 million lower than the requested funding level. For fiscal year 2016, the President's budget recommends an additional $30 million for a total of $110 million. However, the appropriators have recommended only $75 million for the Brownfields program, even lower than the funding level enacted in fiscal year 2015. And the Brownfields program has historically received bipartisan support. Actually was signed in the first year of the second President Bush's administration, and Paul Gilmore and I were the sponsors of it in the House, and we even had a signing ceremony with the President in Pennsylvania that I remember. So it was bipartisan. It promotes job growth, it protects the environment, and safeguards the health of our communities. In fact, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, which shares jurisdiction over the program, has been working on a bipartisan basis on reauthorization. By any measure, the EPA Brownfields program has been an invaluable tool, successfully cleaning contaminated sites while also supporting responsible growth and revitalization of existing communities. Brownfield's investments are working, creating vibrant new community places and replacing lost jobs and taxes on sites where closed industrial plants have left a legacy of blight and contamination, and this reauthorization would expand upon that success. My amendment would raise the authorization level to begin to address the backlog of eligible contaminated sites. It would increase cleanup grant amounts to reflect inflation and allow funds to go to big projects. It would encourage tie-ins between brownfield sustainable development and renewable energy projects. It would address eligibility barriers for nonprofits and local governments and clarify the liability of local governments in foreclosure acquisitions. And it would establish multi-purpose brownfield grants. It would also offer greater assistance to small and rural communities in keeping with the spirit of the underlying bill. Small and rural communities need more than just technical assistance for drinking water. If we're concerned about expired authorizations, we should incorporate this authorization into the bill. And I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to support reauthorization of the Brownsfield program, to work with me and my Democratic colleagues to strengthen this program. And, obviously we're not going to do this today, but I hope we can turn to it in coming months. And I guess I'm disappointed that, we haven't been able to address this. So I would like, before I say anything further, if you would like to comment on this, I'd appreciate it.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yield to the chairman.
Thank you very much. This gives me a good opportunity to kind of just review kind of what the subcommittee's done so far. The algae bloom bill is signed into law. We've got the coal ash bill that might be inserted somewhere in the final process of this year. TSCA is moving forward. We've had numerous hearings on nuclear policy, which we will wrap up into a bill. You've given us another long laundry list of hearings that we should have and consider, and I look forward to doing that. We'll be a very busy subcommittee.
All right. Well, what about brownfields? Can we?
I love the discussion of brownfields.
Okay. All right. Thanks again. And again, I want to stress that, and I already made the point, but, when this was always a very bipartisan issue. I remember was taking it up with Paul Gilmore, and we worked with the EPA then under a Republican administration. So it's not something that should be perceived as partisan, and I don't think you see it that way. So thank you. With that, I'll withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman withdraws the amendment. Is there any other amendments to be considered? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding Senate 611 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned, and I thank my friends for their attendance.